Everybody, and welcome to Hall 7, home of the Conservative Environment Network for the duration of this conference. For those that don't know, CEN is the independent forum for the UK and around the world for people who support net zero, nature restoration and resource security. Thank you all so much for joining for today's event, which is titled Born to be Wild, How Land Use Change Can Help Us to Reach Our Environmental Goals. Before we kick off, I'm going to say a big thank you to our sponsors today, which is the London School of Economics and Political Science. Thank you so much for making this event a possibility. Before I hand over to our... Fantastic. Love the sponsor love. Before we get started with today's discussion, I will just do a bit of housekeeping. So we have an hour and we will hand over to each of our panelists for 3 minutes of introductory remarks each, and then over to you guys for the Q&A. I'll make the point now, but probably have to restate it, that I'm looking for questions, not statements. Please remember that when the microphones start going round. As a little bit of background for today's discussion, as some of you may know, the UK is one of the most nature-depleted countries in the world, and the degradation of our natural assets, such as peatlands, have turned them from carbon stores into greenhouse gas emitters. Whilst there are growing pressures to build more homes, produce more domestic energy, and ensure food security, we also need to squeeze in as much nature as we can too, to help with our environmental goals. With the new government set to introduce a land use framework, many questions remain unanswered, including, can we have it all? And without further ado, I will now hand over to our first panellist of the day, which is Aphra Brandreth. Aphra is the newly elected MP for Chester South and Edinburgh, and is also a member of CEN's Parliamentary Caucus. Over to you, Aphra.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you. Good to see everybody today. And this is a really important topic, so thank you for raising it and for us speaking on it. When we talked about it beforehand, we were talking about kind of what the challenges and opportunities are for land use. And I think there are clearly, for the Conservative Party, but for the country in general, a large number of challenges and opportunities that we need to address. And I do represent Chester South and Edinburgh, which is a largely rural constituency. I'm surrounded by beautiful countryside, farms, and so it's clear and evident every day for me, for the farmers, for the people living locally, just how important our natural environment is and our farming industry is. And it's really important that we highlight those issues and bring them into this discussion. Especially because, to be honest, the current government doesn't really seem to have a good handle on rural affairs. And there are some clear examples of things, for example, that the policies that they're talking about enacting to do with climate change, which is, of course, extremely important, but if they were to enact at the pace and in the way that they want to, all of those policies, a Natural England report has said that could have an impact for our food security of reducing it by about 25%. Now, we're already not self-sufficient in our food security, which potentially means importing more food, which might be grown less sustainably. So there's a lot of follow-on impacts if we don't think through the decisions that we're making. Or there's other things like the National Planning and Policy Framework, which currently requires planners to actually think through food security when they're making an assessment. The current government are talking about dropping that. So these are things that actually we need to make sure that we can address. And as Conservatives, I think that we are able to take a really sensible and pragmatic approach to things. And of course, I want to say that in the context of I feel very strongly about addressing issues around climate change, ensuring that we're looking after our natural environment, our countryside, but that we're making decisions that don't have unintended and adverse consequences. And obviously it was the Conservative government who introduced ELMS, and I'm sure we're going to talk about that in the context of our discussion, but that has been a really big example of something that has had a massive impact on the decisions that farmers are making. I think it was challenging when it was first introduced, but there have been adjustments made. And whilst there are still issues, for example, for tenant farmers, etc., when I've spoken to farmers locally, they have been largely positive about it. And in my constituency, we also have some great examples of rewilding. Cheshire Wildlife are reintroducing beavers for the first time in over 400 years as part of creating new wetlands. We've obviously also in some of the urban and semi-urban areas got some great examples about no-mow May and opportunities for wildflowers. So I think what I really wanted to just kind of highlight is that actually there's a huge opportunity here for us as conservatives to talk about what is fundamentally conservative, which is looking after, conserving our natural environment, but also a fundamental conservative principles of being sensible and pragmatic. And it's really more vital than ever in a context where we have a government who really don't seem to understand rural affairs at all.
Thank you so much, Aphra. Next up, we have Leo Mercer. Leo is the policy analyst at the Grantham Institute on Climate Change and the Environment. Over to you, Leo.
Cool. Thank you very much, and great to be here. So rewilding has never really been conceptualised as a panacea to climate change. Its benefits have always been regarded and recognised in relation to landscape resilience and ecological recovery. But there is evidence regarding its mitigation potential. So you'll forgive me for focusing myopically on the sequestration element of rewilding and those benefits. But for rewilding to be accounted in the National Greenhouse Gas Inventory, the government needs to define or get a precise definition of rewilding and then have available robust longitudinal data on the carbon flux from rewilded habitats. They'll then need to marry that with spatial data to understand the extent of the activity. And so Rothamsted research holds two illustrative data sets on sequestration from proxy rewilded land. The wilderness plots were formerly arable and allowed to regenerate into woodland. And over 118 years, total carbon in soil and biomass at Geescroft was 300 tonnes per hectare and 450 tonnes per hectare at Broadbulk. And two other plots, Highfields and Fosters, were arable, then converted to permanent grassland. And these saw a 50 and 58% respective increase in soil organic carbon relative to the arable control plots. So there is evidence, but these data sets also exemplify the challenges associated with rewilding and carbon accounting. They're just two rewilding transitions in southern England with different management characteristics and location-specific biophysical and climatic factors. And in my discussions I've had with DESNZ, they're not aware of any rewilding data sets which would satisfy UNFCCC reporting requirements at present, and so couldn't be included in the inventory, but this could change over time. And so research that I've published at the LSE has argued that we shouldn't let these data gaps disincentivise rewilding, because even though sequestration occurs more slowly than conventional reforestation, it can still make a meaningful contribution to net zero. And this is most evident when rewilding replaces previously emissions-intensive land uses, and when keystone species are reintroduced, potentially drains are blocked, and there are proximate local seed sources, degraded landscapes will begin to transition from a source to a sink of CO2. But rewilding really needs to be considered in relation to the wider changes we need to make to land use as we transition towards net zero. So the Climate Change Committee's sixth carbon budget and the National Food Strategy provide some guidance on this transition. And at a high level, we need to expand carbon sinks in productive landscapes. This needs to be chiefly achieved through peatland restoration and reforestation, but also through agroforestry, rewilding, agroecological farming, and high nature value farming models, because these land uses continue to produce food, they sequester more carbon in soils and biomass, and they also build our adaptive capacity to climate change through natural flood management and enhanced ecological complexity. And so post-Brexit, as we develop the new agri-environment schemes, we're actually fundamentally rewriting the contract with farmers by requiring improved environmental outcomes for public money. And this is fair, in my opinion, and I presume many others. Given the increasing share of emissions we expect to see from agriculture as other economic sectors decarbonise more quickly, and the dire statistics we see regarding nature decline, and we'll hear more about today. But the Climate Change Committee and many other organisations have repeatedly warned that policies to support farmers in this transition has been insufficient, and these uncertainties have dampened interest in the Landscape Recovery Scheme, which is best equipped to support rewilding. The promised three-way funding split within ELMS hasn't seemed to have eventuated, and has instead supported the sustainable farming incentive. So this is really just a call to arms that we must pressure the government to, at the very least, retain the current agricultural budget, but ideally increase it to match the to support the transition to nature-positive food production. We're at an inflection point where we need to massively ramp up funding for sequestration and nature recovery in line with statutory commitments under the Environment and Climate Change Acts. And we just need to understand that it's fanciful to assume farmers will participate en masse in these schemes if they're not fairly recompensed. So we need to see increased fair incentives, we need technical and skills assistance, and we need to see policy stability to support this transition. Thanks.
Thank you, Leo. Next up, we have Alastair Driver. Alastair, you wear many hats, but I'll go today with Director of Rewilding Britain.
Great. Thank you very much. Hi, everybody. I'm a lifelong ecologist, 46 years as a professional, and I've had the great privilege of working on thousands of restoration projects, nature restoration projects, in collaboration with farmers and landowners across the country in that time. But sadly, we're still going backwards on biodiversity, despite many incredible efforts of thousands of people from hundreds of organisations. We need something additional to this traditional nature conservation, agri-environment schemes, good planning policies, etc. We need something very significantly additional, not instead of. And for me, 8 years into this job with Rewilding Britain now, I'm absolutely certain that that missing piece is rewilding, large-scale restoration of ecosystems to the point where nature is allowed to take care of itself. Recognising, of course, that rewilding is a spectrum of activity, and the very top of that spectrum we're unlikely to achieve because we don't have the apex predators and some of the large herbivores. So we should focus on at least getting onto that spectrum. And if you look at the many hundreds of rewilding sites that now exist in this country, they're about halfway up. They're the Neps, the Ennerdales, the Haweswaters, the Ken Hills of this world that you might have seen in the media. They're halfway up that spectrum. They still produce food. They produce approximately 50% of the food. But they also produce incredible amounts of carbon sequestration, flood risk management benefits, water quality benefits, health and well-being benefits, educational benefits, and above all, and I know because I've seen at least 200 of them now in the last few years, they deliver amazing bioabundance of wildlife. Bioabundance. Some rarity, yes, and you'll hear about purple emperors, etc. now, but the abundance of species that returns to the environment if you just give nature a helping hand is truly extraordinary. I see it day to day. I was on 7 sites in the last 2 weeks, and every single site delivered on that. So we need to accept that it's part of the future solutions. It's not the silver bullet. But how do we mainstream it? Well, we just carried out a YouGov poll in Rewilding Britain and in the last few weeks, and it got an 83% popularity rating. Now imagine that for a political party. 83%. You'd struggle to get that for ice cream or, motherhood and apple pie. So that's great, and that's actually gone up from 81% 3 years ago when we last did it. So we know the public get it and want it, but government needs to get it, and they need to be brave and bold about it. Every single meeting I have with government officials or government agencies, every single meeting, we will no doubt come across the subject of the R word. Oh yeah, we don't use the R word. And I've got a glossary of the most incredibly boring alternatives that people have conjured up to stop using the R word. But we must start using it and use it in the proper context where it's appropriate with a clear definition and set of principles. And that already exists because IUCN, the international organisation that promotes nature conservation, have got a definition and principles. Rewilding Britain has the same definition and principles. It is defined. If NatureScot can produce a statement on it, a position on it, which they have done, then so should Natural England and so should DEFRA. And that should be a pan-government accepted definition. So that's the first ask of government, any government, and we were nearly there with the Conservatives last time. I was working with the team and we almost got there. Secretary of State changed and I'm afraid it got binned. So it cannot be down to the whim of an individual. It has to be a government commitment. The second thing is, I'll just echo, I won't go into detail, but absolutely, environmental land management scheme has to be properly funded at the right level. Landscape recovery is the bit where rewilding can really deliver because it's all about scale. It's about farmers joining up and other landowners, not just farmers, joining up at scale, delivering to that ambition. Private finance. Now, we have lots of companies, banks, financial organisations talking about financing rewilding. They're excited by it. But nobody yet at any significant level has actually handed over some money. And I'm involved in helping one or two organisations, landowners in a private capacity, and we've been talking for 2 years now and still no money on the table. We need an approved accreditation scheme from government for rewilding to be funded through private finance. And we need a set of rules. And we need maybe, I don't know, I'm not an expert in this, but maybe tax breaks for the right sort of organisation doing the right kind of things. We need to get them to stick their necks above the parapet. Absolutely fundamental. And thirdly, my third of three big asks of government land. I've just spent a couple of days on Otterburn last week with the Army. And they have to try to get to net zero by 2040, I think their target is. I mean, that's quite challenging for an army. But one of the ways they can do it is manage their land in a more sustainable way. But it's quite clear to me that there are many challenges there, and funding is an important part of that. But if you think of the Crown Estate and the MOD, Forestry England, Dashire Cornwall, between them, they've got hundreds of thousands of hectares of land which we could rewild. It's not just down to the private landowners. They're only about a quarter of the solution at the moment. These government bodies really need to step up and create this step change. So those are my asks. Like I say, not the silver bullet, but it's a fundamental piece of restoring biodiversity and helping us to mitigate climate change. Thank you.
Thank you, Alastair. Next up, we have Sir Robert Buckland, the former MP for South Swindon, former very active member of SEN's Parliamentary Caucus, and he previously also held the position of Secretary of State for Wales as well as Lord Chancellor. Robert.
Well, thank you very much. And first of all, my humble apologies for not being able to find this room. I don't know. This is a modern Hogwarts, this building. I've been coming to Birmingham. I think we've all been coming to Birmingham for about 15 years. Does anybody know where the link to the Hyatt is? I still don't know where it is. Anyway, it's one of the mysteries perhaps we'll solve in the next few days. But look, it's great to be here. I'm sorry, listening to Alastair is always a pleasure. I'm sorry I haven't heard Aphra, who I'm delighted has entered Parliament in the place of the admirable Ed Timpson, my great friend at Edisbury. And of course, Aphra borders Wales, her seat borders Wales. I just want to inject a little bit of politics into all of this and remind you about the headlines in Wales at the thick end of about 6 or 7 months ago, where as a result of a Welsh Labour government that was trying to do things to people, we had quite a problem with Welsh farmers who were extremely concerned about the didactic approach being taken by Cardiff to the way in which they manage their farms, many of which are very small farms. I'm from Carmarthenshire, big dairy area, and these are small farms, very often handed down through generations, and farmers there can be trusted to look after the environments that they are responsible for, and they felt very strongly that they weren't being trusted, they were being talked down to, and we almost saw we did see a bit of a French-style rebellion at one point, led by none other than the great Welsh rugby referee Nigel Owens, who is now, of course, more than turning his hand to looking after the land that he loves in my part of the world. Look, the message there is simple. If you don't take landowners and farmers with you, then none of this is going to work. Which is why I particularly think that the take-up in terms of the different schemes is interesting. The landscape recovery scheme has been the one that I think has been very successful, because that's been a bespoke approach worked out between the landowner and the agency in order to make sure that what is happening there is right for that particular area, that parcel of land, that particular farm or particular tract of land. And that bespoke approach might be painstaking, it might take a longer time, but you're bringing people and communities with you in order to achieve what I think most of us in the room would agree is the absolutely essential aim of making sure that through rewilding that we can not just deliver net zero but also regenerate the natural environment, which in Britain we know has been significantly depleted, and that's a fact of our life on this busy island. We're all going about our daily lives, and we're in danger of missing the fact that the huge variable, the huge variety of flora and fauna is not what it was even when we were younger, and therefore we have a responsibility now in order to do something about it. And that's why I think rewilding is such an important part of that. We know that through the development of wildflower meadows, we create a much better root structure, which is good for the land, good for the soil. We know that in making sure that there is a proper predator scale in terms of wildlife, that we get the balance right. Now, only last year, the CEN were very kind to take me and others out to Andalusia, and we went to see the work that's being done there in order to repopulate that part of Spain with the lynx. Now, not uncontroversial, the lynx is a predator. We did manage to see quite a few of them when we were there. And there's a genuine and legitimate worry, I think, amongst many landowners here in the UK that if we take a similar approach, then what does that mean for their livestock and indeed the safety of their livestock? Now, I do think that in consultation with landowners and with farmers, we can take, I think, a nuanced and appropriate approach to the way in which we look at bringing back certain types of wildlife. Britain, is not in the sense of Spain as big and as open an environment, but I do think that rather than shutting our ears and eyes to it, we should be absolutely more than looking, but seeing whether or not we can replicate some of the excellent work that I saw over in Andalusia. One of the last campaigns I launched before I left office as Member of Parliament for South Swindon was to ask for the North Wessex Downs AONB to be designated a national park. Why? Because I strongly believe that whilst appellations are important, I think what lies behind that is a real commitment to make sure that one of the most outstanding landscapes in southern England is preserved in the way that I think all of us would want to see. An ancient landscape stretching back to the Bronze Ages, which I think for anybody who's been there will know how significant it is historically and environmentally for not just that part of Wessex, but indeed the whole of the south of England. But there's no doubt that although national parks are pretty well associated with quite strict and stringent planning requirements, in order to make sure that buildings are within the character of the park, there isn't, it seems to me, the accompanying a focus on the sort of approach that we want to see in terms of rewilding. And if this government is, as is rumoured, intent upon cutting budgets, then we really are going to have to look elsewhere for leadership, either through our party or indeed, as Alastair says, by making sure that the private sector has the confidence in being able to invest in these schemes. And I think ideas such as accreditation, as tax breaks, I think all those things, frankly, are not a luxury, they're a necessity if we are to see the level of investment that we need in our countryside from the private sector, because government isn't going to be able to do this alone. It's just not going to have the resources, bearing in mind the scale of the challenge that we have. And again, the point I think is well made, that by setting an example in using the Crown Estate and other tracts of, huge tracts of government land, for example in Wiltshire, the MOD own huge tracts of Salisbury Plain, huge strides can be made. I think we should need to, in this session, to watch very carefully the new Crown Estate Bill, which is being brought forward mainly with a focus on making sure that the seabed, which of course the Crown Estate owns, is able to be developed for more offshore wind, something I strongly support, and when I was Welsh Secretary was very keen to pursue in the Celtic Sea. But there might be other benefits that can be realised through that bill, which can perhaps free up the Crown Estate to do even more and be even more imaginative about public-private funding partnerships in order to really get the benefits of rewilding and of an environmental approach that I know government and its agencies should be setting the best example on. So I think a lot to be concerned about, a lot of political pitfalls that we must avoid, but as Conservatives, I think we've got a strong record on this. I think we should be confident and front-footed about our arguments, and that we should not be afraid to take on this government and to really challenge their commitment to not just our rural way of life, but our very environment itself. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And last but by no means least, we have Tom Bradshaw. Tom is the president of the National Farmers Union. Over to you, Tom.
And I know Kitty's going to be desperate for me to only do 3 minutes, but I'm not sure if that's possible. Look, Robert, you made a really important point there about taking farmers with us on this journey. And I would encourage everyone here to think about the language. When we talk about biodiversity decline, all too often farmers are blamed. It's a societal issue. All farmers have ever done is follow policy. It's shoppers' decisions that have ended up driving where we are today. And Alastair, you made a point about 83% support something. You didn't actually say what it was, but I think it was rewilding.
Yeah, sorry, rewilding.
83% may think it's a good idea, but 83% don't then support that with the shopping decisions they make. And how do we make sure that what we're talking about here, what we're talking about in this room, is a food systems change? It's not about rewilding. It's about how do we solve climate change. It's about how do we solve biodiversity. How do we embed that within our food system is the challenge I would ask every one of us to think about here. We've heard from Aphra, food security is national security. Unfortunately, the geopolitical situation we see globally at the moment is probably the most uncertain we've seen for several decades. And at a time where we see that uncertainty, we see protectionism. Now, the NFU have been roundly criticised by probably many in the party whose conference we're at here about our trade stance. All we've ever stood for is fair trade, which is very, very different to free trade. And if we want to embed the changes that we're talking about here within our food system, we have to make sure that our food system isn't undermined by imports, which will come in and that doesn't carry the cost of the biodiversity decline or the carbon accounting with it. So we have to look at trade policy which embeds sustainability, which embeds net zero and carbon border adjustment mechanisms, so that there's a fair and just transition can happen here in the UK. Because if not, our members will go out of business producing food. And at a time of food insecurity, we have to think about how we drive this change in a fair and just transition so that everybody can earn a fair share out of it. The budget has been highlighted. We know that we've had the budget modelled by Anderson's. Many of the environmental NGOs have as well. Between £5.5 and £6 billion is what is required just to deliver the legislated targets. But I also think when we talk about language, we have to be really careful. We've already had many millions of pounds invested in biodiversity recovery over the last 30 years. And yet we're still proudly sitting here saying we're at a tipping point. We've got a massive biodiversity decline. We're the most depleted in the world. What is that public money delivering? Because if we're making a case for more public money, the baselines that underpin that are absolutely essential. Science, data, evidence has to underpin this journey for everybody that's going to be part of it. And at the moment, we have not had good enough baselines, whether that be for biodiversity, whether it be for carbon, or whether it be for water quality and things like that, which are becoming far more topical. So I think we have to look at how we balance all of that out. What I would say is we need to separate food production from environmental degradation. Feeding 9.5 billion people on this planet will have an impact. We can't simply offshore that impact to other parts of the world and believe that's okay. What I would say to every one of our members is we should target being in the top quartile of the lowest impact globally on food production. so that we have permission to continue producing. But to do that, we need good data, we need good evidence, and we need a trade policy which underpins it and enables that change.
Thank you, Tom. I wondered before I hand over to Q&A, so get... Okay. I thought, Leo, would you like to come back on the data point, being the data man on the panel?
Not sure I'll claim that, but no, I completely agree. I think we could learn a lot from Northern Ireland and their soil nutrient health scheme, and participation in that as a precondition to receiving new sustainable farming incentives. So, yeah, I think farmers will say that they don't actually know what their baseline nutrient balances are. And I think it's really important to get everyone speaking the same language, government taking in that data, and then being supplied with the with the information and the strategies to rectify that where there are imbalances within that farm system. So yeah, monitoring, reporting, and verification really critical. It's also really important for setting your baselines if you're embarking on some sort of reforestation or peatland restoration program as well. You need to figure out what you're going to be credited against. So yeah, couldn't agree more.
Fantastic. Okay, we'll go over to Q&A now. So anybody that would like to ask a question, please raise your hand. I think there's a member of the SEND team coming. I will start with Tony Travers on the second row. I'll take them in batches of 3 and then we can address them all.
Hello, I'm Tony Travers from the London School of Economics, and very glad to be here co-sponsoring this excellent event. First, good to hear about the reintroduction of beavers in Cheshire, because that hard-working creature is the LSE's mascot. So that's the first thing to say. But on a less helpful note, I mean, you'll all be aware the new government, like significant parts of the Conservative Party's philosophy, thinks growth in Britain needs to be driven up fast. And a lot of those who believe in that are much more relaxed about using land for new growth-related purposes than some of those that we're hearing discussed here today. So how to trade off the excellent ideas here put forward with the drive for growth that does need to use apparently green land and to be much more aware of growth being important rather than some of the issues that you've been putting forward today. There are big trade-offs. They just can't be, I know you're not, but they can't just be dismissed. So how can that trade-off be made?
Thank you, Tony. Next, we will have Alyssa on the front row.
Thank you. I'm Councillor Alyssa Swigglehurst from Herefordshire County Council, Cabinet Member for the Environment. We have 2 landscape recovery schemes in the county covering thousands of hectares. What I'm interested in is what are the potential and limits for local authorities to support and enable this kind of work, either through the local nature recovery strategy and biodiversity net gain instruments or any other tool that we might have in the toolbox. Thank you.
Thank you. And then the third one for this set, in the middle there. I can't see. Oh, there we go. Yes.
Thank you very much, Bess Rhodes. I am an environmental historian, and I'm very aware that very large tracts of the British Isles have been farmed since prehistoric times. But historically, many of those farms were more biodiverse, and they're also a lot smaller. Yet small farms are going out of business. It's absolutely terrifying. I know of Scottish communities who say that they're facing the clearances again. It's so extreme. I'd be really interested in the panel's perspective on how we can support small farms to be biodiverse and to be economically viable.
Thank you very much for that question. We'll start with the question on economic growth and potentially the opportunity of rewilding in that. Alastair, I wondered if you wanted to come in on that.
Thank you. Yes. Although I'm not a big fan of just relentless growth for the sake of it, there's no doubt that the diversification that goes with the rewilding projects gives us the opportunity to improve the number of jobs. I collect the data from all the sites I visit. I've got over 50,000 hectares worth of rewilding data, and it shows a 93% increase in full-time equivalent jobs. Now, it's not huge numbers we're talking about, but when you're talking about very small rural communities, every single job counts. And it also demonstrates, we've also been able to demonstrate a significant expansion of the ranges of income that rewilding sites can draw in. And that is then leading to greater engagement with volunteers, a tenfold increase in volunteer engagement on these sites, which is then helping to draw in more money into local communities. So there is scope for small degrees of growth, socioeconomic growth. And indeed, that is one of the 5 principles that underpin rewilding. It has to work socioeconomically. So there is a glimmer of hope, but I because of the numbers involved, you're going to need a lot more than that. And don't forget, Rewilding Britain is calling for 30% rewilding, but you've still got another 70% of the country, which is going to be much more intensive.
Thank you. Leah, did you want to come on that question as well?
Salient point. But I think we can manage those trade-offs as best as possible. So if we're thinking about a lot of the growth is in relation to renewable energy infrastructure, and when that is well managed, we can also see improvements in biodiversity as well. So just an example, there's some pretty compelling evidence that with solar PV deployment on more marginal farmlands, if you have scatter seeds and have good setbacks, you can actually have boost habitat for pollinators, beneficial insects, and so on. So it's just about how we go about some of these growth opportunities, and not just growing for the sake of it, but trying to grow smartly as well.
Thank you. Aphra, would you like to come in on this question?
Yeah, just a couple of points, actually. I mean, I don't think that we should present it as a choice between growth and the environment. There obviously are decisions and trade-offs to be made, but of course we know that if we grow the economy, we've got money to invest in many of these projects. We're talking about needing to increase budgets. That has to be done through a growing and effective economy. So I definitely wouldn't want to present it as a trade-off. It's a balance. This whole question is a balance about how we use our land and the competing objectives that we have between food security, energy security, building more homes, and also conserving nature. Often I think those decisions need to be made locally, because if you try and make those decisions at a national level, none of us know what the specific issues are in different areas, and farmers have to be part of that conversation because they often know that land better than any of us. So I think a focus on that local decision making is really important, and also looking at kind of innovative decisions. This is not something I'm an expert in, but I was talking with somebody about kind of solar panels, and in Cheshire and my area we have a lot of dairy farms. Often that kind of the grading of that land is at a level where people might be talking about the fact that you could put solar panels, etc. on it. Apparently there are areas where you have kind of raised solar panels, so you can still have grazing underneath. We need to be thinking about innovative decisions that mean we get better and more effective use of our land, so we can meet our environmental goals, but without compromising growth, which is vitally important.
Absolutely. Tom, did you want to come in on this?
Just very quickly, if you think about what the system that I was talking about there, inevitably food prices are going to go up, and real wage growth is absolutely essential to enable that transition. If you don't get real wage growth so that people have got more disposable income, then this is a downward spiral. So I'm afraid growth really is one of the absolutely core elements to enabling what we've been talking about in here.
Fantastic. I wondered also, would you like to come on to the third question about smaller biodiverse farms?
We're making huge sweeping generalisations when we talk about biodiversity decline, and this is the problem. We just do not have the evidence at a local level, and I think we've got to be really, really careful that we don't look. There is a massive crisis of confidence in the farming industry at the moment. When you speak to the rural help charities, mental health pressures on the industry are at levels we've never seen before. And when we're making sweeping statements about biodiversity decline, I would love to see the SFI incentivise proper baseline audits for all farm businesses so that you know what you're working with. And I think you'll find there's many areas where this is nowhere near as bad as people are making out. But the story, the sensationalism, it just continues to go round and round. So look, the small farm bit is really difficult. I think there is probably a point coming, and I caution how I say this. In France, being a part-time farmer is not, it doesn't come with a stigmatism. here, being a part-time farmer, for some reason, has some stigmatism attached to it. And I think we've got to get beyond that. If you like the way of life, if you want to maintain that farm, then farming doesn't owe anyone a living. It's not. It doesn't have to be able to make you a living just because you have a farm. But if you want to maintain that lifestyle, then you've got to look at it through the lens of economics as well, and how you maintain that farm business in the way that it keeps your family and it enables you to do what you want to do.
NFU always lobbies for large farmers and contractors.
Absolute rubbish. Absolute rubbish. I'm sorry. Our average member is 230 acres, so that is absolute rubbish.
Pick that up at the stand rather than this panel, please, sir. I will go over to Robert.
Yeah, very briefly. Thank you, Kitty. Look, I think already we're having quite a lively debate here. Look, I think there are plenty of examples of small holdings where very committed landowners are already making changes, and there are lots of schemes. I was on my very best friend's farm up in the Lake District, where they have taken advantage of an excellent scheme to direct the river through their small holding in its natural path. It's creating a marsh. It's creating a whole new environment for biodiversity. That's just one small example of what is happening across the country, and I do think that through those those small steps we then create that much bigger approach. I've been around the houses on planning for many years. I've been a planning councillor in Wales. I've been a constituency MP representing a very land intensive area with lots of housing development. And I can tell you the worst developments are the ones that end up after an appeal. Because then after the huge fight that has gone on, there's no real obligation on the developer to really get it right from the outset. And opportunities are missed, I think. Green corridors, wildlife corridors, all those things that with sensitivity make a good development a great one are then missed. And therefore, as we go down this into this brave new world of more housing, which I'm entirely in favour of, by the way, it cannot be beyond the wit of us in the 21st century to get the trade-off that Tony talks about by making sure that developers really build in to their thinking all the considerations that I think will go to better rewilding. Every parcel of land in my former constituency mattered to me, and there were opportunities, even on a small scale in sunny Swindon, to make a difference by making sure that technically greenfield land that had no value was actually being put to the best use in terms of rewilding. We should not lose any opportunity to do that wherever it can be done. And of course, it ties in, frankly, to the debate about security. I don't think that rewilding is some sort of problem when it comes to the essential security of this country, because what we are doing is, in fact, through sensible rewilding, enhancing our general security and putting it as part of that argument so that we're getting the best out of our land in terms of food production, that we are getting more energy supply through the net zero approaches. Then I think we can actually knit this together in a way that stops this sort of either-or argument that can bedevil this particular debate.
Thank you so much, Robert. We'll go through a few more questions. Another clap for Robert. The handsome man with the beard and the glasses.
Bless you, Kitty. Very kind. Garrison Orne from Chester Zoo. Delighted to see our newest Chester MP on the panel. Very much looking forward to working with you, Aphra, over the coming years. At the risk of introducing another controversial topic, I wanted to ask the panel about access to nature. So at the zoo, we're currently working on a project to restore roughly 60 square miles in our local area to enhance wildlife. And obviously we're working very closely with our local authority, with community groups and indeed landowners. And one of the key mechanisms by which we're doing that is looking to increase people's access to green and blue spaces. So I'd be interested to know the panel's view on how that fits into this agenda, where potential conflicts are with rewilding as well.
Thank you, Gareth. Next up, could you hand the microphone to the lady near Gareth, please, Katie? Thank you.
Hi, thank you. I'm Emily Hunter from the Woodland Trust. I'm just thinking, we're that we're expecting a lot from our land, and we've heard a few of the things here, like nature recovery, food production, housing, energy infrastructure. And this is the second panel I've listened to where I've been really surprised that no one's mentioned the idea of the land use framework. So I just would be interested to know the panel's thoughts on whether that could help address some of this and what they think about that.
Thank you. And then the third question for this triplet, perhaps the woman behind you.
Hello. Sorry to be Woodland Trust heavy. Just off the back of Emily's question, I was just wondering whether you guys think the land use framework will be as effective as possible if it's not embedded in all departments of government. Yeah.
Thank you so much. On the first point of access to nature, Tom, perhaps I'll come to you after that.
Yeah, I think one of the NFU's biggest lobbying successes in recent months has been having the right to roam removed from the Labour manifestos. So look, we have real concerns about the impact on our members' businesses. We see a huge amount of livestock worrying already, and we have to be very mindful that not everyone now knows how to look after their pets, and that moves on to nature as well. So we can't take access to nature lightly, but I also recognise that there are a lot of people that don't know the nature that exists out there. So there's a balance to strike. And we have one of the best footpath networks in the world. I think looking at how we utilise that footpath network and maybe embed access within the SFI, so there's optional access, there's two simple solutions there that probably don't need rocket scientists to make it work. And I think sometimes we shoot for the stars rather than looking at the foundations of what we've already got. And I think generally we have a very good access network already. Inner city access to nature is not my area of expertise, but I think that is probably a slightly different topic where there is more restricted access because many people don't have cars, and trying to bring nature to the city is probably more relevant in this situation than necessarily the right to roam or broad scale access out in the countryside.
Aphra, go for it.
Just because obviously this is very close to my constituency, and just want to say, I mean, Chester Zoo do an amazing job, and are real leaders in this area. And I think it's really exciting the work that's being done to enhance nature and how different corridors and linking up is really important. I mean, ultimately, the connection that we all have to our environment is so important, and as we become more urbanised, that is becoming harder and harder, and it's a real issue, I think, especially in my rural constituency. You see in terms of challenges with employing people, finding people to work in farms, etc., because everybody is so urbanised in their thinking. So I think whatever we can do to help reconnect people with the environment is really important, and to actually understand things like where our food comes from, because we're all completely disconnected, and so many people now just go to the supermarket and actually have no idea of the process that is going through to get to that point. So I think we've all got a part to play in basically supporting and building those connections, and obviously what Chester Zoo is doing as part of that is very important.
Fantastic. Alastair, I wondered if you wanted to come back on both questions, firstly on access and then on the land use framework.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Yeah, it's a double-edged sword, of course, this access issue. But if we ask ourselves the question, should we have more or less? Well, clearly we do need more, because detachment from nature has been the single biggest issue that has led to the state we're in now. We have completely forgotten what the baseline was originally. We've forgotten what things need to survive. So overall, I support more access, but we have to be very careful about open access. And I see that because I'm a private advisor for a state in Yorkshire. We've created a 27-kilometre permissive path around there. But as we fully expected, already we have issues with dogs off leads. And that is by far the number one issue that I come across in all the sites I visit. So we have to be very careful about this, but I'm just stating clearly, of course we need to re-engage people with nature. That does mean managed access, but it doesn't necessarily always mean open access. That's a personal view, not necessarily a corporate view for Rewilding Britain, but that's my experience. In terms of a land use strategy, absolutely, that's what we need. It was fourth on my list. I decided to stick to 3. But we need that. And if I may just quickly give the Broughton example, we've done that for a 2,500 acre estate. We've got rewilding blocks. We've got regenerative agriculture or nature-friendly farming blocks. We've got intensive AHA agreements, pre-existing that we can't change. We've got some registered parkland, and we've got horticulture to carry on producing other sorts of food. That is a microcosm of what we should have across the country. We've done it for a big estate. All big estates could do this, and probably many do. We need to roll that out across the country. It is time to start being strategic, because I firmly believe if we do that at that kind of scale, the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. And that is a really important point I'd like to leave with. Yeah.
Fantastic. Robert, I wondered, given your experience in government and different departments, if you would like to touch on the value of a land use framework and then embedding it in all departments and perhaps some of the challenges that might face.
Well, we've been waiting a long time, haven't we? It's been talked about. We've had different ministers with different views. I think. Look, I think the struggle is a political one. I think that ministers will have looked across to Wales and seen the example, as I mentioned in my main presentation, about how things can go wrong from a political point of view. However, the pronouncements about it being mere guidance should cause some concern, because if it is just guidance, how binding is it going to be? If it doesn't have any targets in it, how effective is it going to be? How transparent is it going to be? Look, I think that now we've got a new government, they better get on with their intended aim of producing an LUF. But if they think that they can just, sign something off and then sit back and fold their arms, it's another thing coming. This will have to be a living document, and it will have to be something that genuinely works with the grain, rather than something that, as I've described, is seen to be top-down and didactic. So it's, again, a good old-fashioned balance that needs to be struck on LUF, but let's see whether this government now has the political courage to get on with it.
Leo, I wondered if you wanted to come in on the land use framework point.
Yeah, just briefly, agree with a lot of what's been said. We need it to be as high definition as possible for it to actually be useful at a local level. But I think also perhaps you identify areas where there's high carbon and biodiversity overlap. If that's what we're trying to incentivize, then we just need the incentives to be good enough for land managers to make the decision on their private land in their own right, if they want to reforest or restore peatland or whatever it may be. So getting high granular geospatial data to support local land use decision making, and then having the incentives underneath so that landowners can make whatever decisions are best for their land.
Thank you. I think we've got time for one more round of questions, so hands in the air, please. Katie, the hand nearest you.
Hiya, Sienna from Friends of the Earth. We've heard beavers being mentioned, and I think they're a success story. What species would the panel like to see reintroduced either in their area or nationally, and what do you think the barriers are to getting that done?
Next, shall we have this hand there? Yeah,
Captive breeding to start with.
Thank you. Hello there, I'm Alison Rankin-Frost from Holborn and St Pancras Conservative Association, and I'm also on the board of British Equestrian, where we represent 3.5 million people who use land for sport and recreation with horses. We're introducing an initiative to encourage all of our members to use their land more effectively and sustainably, from things like herbal lays and small areas of rewilding and bits of land that they can't use, and rainwater reharvesting, etc., etc. But one of the things I'd like to ask you about, we also have a lot of buildings. We have indoor schools, and we have got stable blocks and things like that. It seems to be easier to put solar panels onto usable land than it is to put them onto the roofs of these buildings. So if you could comment on that, please.
Sure, I'll leave it there for now because I'm conscious of time. But on the species question, I will use my power as chair to say pine martens, because that is the theme of today's stall in the exhibition space for Sen. So do pop by afterwards. But Aphra, which species would you like to see and why?
I mean, I'm obviously going to give a pitch for the beavers since we've got them in Cheshire, but, you know, really interested to hear what others' ideas are. I mean, I think whatever decisions are made, obviously there are impacts and implications from any kind of reintroduction of species anywhere. So we need to be very careful about when we're doing that and what the implications of that are, because actually if these things go wrong, it will cause an impact for other reintroduction projects. So a slightly cautious approach would be we need to do it, but make sure we're doing it sensibly and that we're monitoring what the impact of that is, because once you've let creatures out, you can't exactly take them back.
Absolutely. Tom, which creature?
I'd much rather comment on solar panels.
We'll get to that.
I would completely endorse what Aphra said about the impacts. I would also say that a conversation I had last week at the other conference, you know, the other place, as they say, was actually really, really interesting about what we don't want to do. What somehow has happened is landowners, farmers have been pitched against some of this species reintroduction plans. That really doesn't benefit anybody, because you end up with a lot of sort of inbuilt anger before the conversation started. But actually having a control strategy in place, knowing that something like beavers is going to end up everywhere. So let's put the control strategy in place so that if they end up somewhere undermining something they shouldn't be doing, you know how you're going to be able to control that species. And if I just think about our fenlands, for instance, we know that over 50% of our most productive farmland is situated in low-lying areas, particularly floodplains, but a lot of that's in the fens. Beavers in the fens, unless we genuinely don't want to produce food on that best farmland, is going to be difficult. But if you don't have a control strategy and beavers end up in the fens, what happens? You end up with war of farmers versus nature, and then farmer groups versus nature groups. So I think having a grown-up endpoint for how you might be able to intervene in this before the species is reintroduced would be a really sensible step. With beavers, we're not there. There is a control program which is sort of all drafted out, but it's never been published.
Absolutely. And for your good answer, I'll let you talk about solar as well very briefly.
Solar, we would love to see permitted development rights for small-scale wind, solar and battery-mounted, but grid connectivity is the barrier to that. There is more cost on putting it in roofs. A small subsidy, like the last party that was in power had introduced, a 25% grant scheme for small scale, is actually really, really beneficial because it just pivots it back to roofs rather than being ground mounted. When you look at the scale of roofs there is across the country, whether that be farmland or farm buildings or whether it be industrial buildings, we've got to think about how we utilise that space which has already been taken up, which is not delivering for anything else, and prioritise those areas that could be utilised.
Fantastic. Alastair, which species?
How long you got? Before I say that, could I just flag that I've got some copies of this Rewilding manifesto that we just produced for this round of conferences. Please help yourselves, they're at the front. Well, my beavers, we're almost there. So let's take that. Pine martins, we're pretty much there. White-tailed eagles, etc., moving in the right direction. For me, it's the Eurasian lynx. That, you know, for me, if I see it in my lifetime, you know, I'll be satisfied that we have made some progress, because we need to get apex predator, at least an apex predator, back into the landscape for people to have a better understanding of the value of these creatures to the ecosystem and indeed to people and communities. Of course, it has to be done with the right rules, and there are plenty of guidelines on that, and I would never expect any government to approve a project that hadn't got a proper management protocol in place. But Eurasian lynx, not so much the race that occurs in Spain and Portugal, but in most of the rest of Europe, is actually a very shy, secretive species. You need to have measures in place to make sure that farmers are part of a scheme that means that they are effectively paid for allowing links on their land. I'm not such a big fan of compensation schemes. We discussed this on the parliamentary inquiry a year or two ago. But if we had measures in place, like, for example, a landscape recovery component of a farming scheme where farmers signed up in a big area to be part of in a site where links were reintroduced, I'm absolutely certain it can work, and I'm also certain it could generate much more significant socioeconomic benefits. So yeah, that's what I'm hoping to see in my lifetime. And as you can tell, I'm no spring chicken, so we need to crack on.
Fantastic. I'm conscious of time, but we did start a few minutes late. So if you'll allow me, I'm going to do a quick fire round to end the panel. What is the policy that you either want the new government to do or not do? I'll start with you, Tom. One sentence, though, please.
Unfortunately, the endangered species, the tenant farmer, hasn't been mentioned today. And I think we have to really think about how these changes that are being talked about impact the tenant farmer sector. They are generally one of the most entrepreneurial sectors you will find, and there is a real risk that we may find, well, we are finding, but we could find an existential threat to many tenants.
Aphra.
I think the main point I want to make is that this is really all about balance. I think that is the word that has come up most on the panel. And whatever we do, I want to make sure that we're taking a balanced approach to it and not ending up in a situation where we're merely outsourcing all of our production and actually ending up with loss of nature beyond the UK, climate change beyond the UK, because we've moved so quickly here that we haven't actually thought about what the unintended consequences can be, but also being ambitious and being innovative, because this is crucial. So we've got to think big.
Leo.
I would just say stick with elms, properly capitalise it. Farmers are just getting used to it. If it ain't broke, don't fix it.
Alastair.
My ask is for government to have a positive position on rewilding. So we've got a starting point, and I don't have to spend endless conversations trying to justify it.
And Robert.
Yeah, so I would absolutely make sure that the landscape recovery tier of elms is maintained and properly funded. It's the one with the biggest take-up, and it seems to be working. And I wasn't allowed to tell you my favourite animal. I mean, the romantic in me wants the brown bear back, but I don't think we're going to get that. But the practical within me wants the mining bee. We need our mining bees back.
Okay. And with that, this panel comes to a close. Thank you so much for you all for attending. Thank you to our panellists, and thank you especially to our sponsor, the London School of Economics and Political Science. And if you want to stick around, in half an hour, our next event is net zero an electoral asset or liability for the Conservatives? See you then.
Well done, Robert.
Nice to see you.
Man.